We're here with Maajid Nawaz. He's the co-founder and executive director of Quilliam, a think tank dedicated to challenge religious radicalism. Mr. Nawaz, thank you very much for being here and also coming to the St. Gallen Symposium as a speaker. The roots of religious radicalization have extensively been analyzed and discussed. But why do we mostly focus on fighting its consequences?
I think understanding in challenging extremisms in the plural is evolving. And I think if you took us back to 3 years ago, your statement would have been correct. Many people were looking at the implications, the consequences and the results of extremism. Now people are developing a more holistic approach. So I'll give you one example. I'm involved in a program, in a global initiative that will culminate in a summit in Dublin in about a month's time. And I've used extremisms in the plural here deliberately because what we've done is, in conjunction with the Council on Foreign Relations based in the US and interestingly with Google, we've gathered a network of former extremists from across the board, and that includes those who have come from a far-right fascist background and have disavowed their previous beliefs, those who've come from even a gang culture in Los Angeles and have disavowed that and are now working to challenge the gang culture within LA, and former Islamist extremists. And we brought them all together to look at the common root causes among all of these trends and to explore how extremism manifests itself in different cultural contexts, and that's the important thing. And if you can look at it from that perspective, then you isolate two things. One, the causes that are common between all of these threads, and you're not picking on just any element. The second thing you recognize is that overwhelmingly it's young people that join extremisms across the board. It's young and vulnerable people who join these things, and then you start questioning, why is it that young people are joining these various extremist causes? And I think it's, just to finish off on this point, understanding has developed to a point where there's generally a consensus now that it revolves around 4 core factors. One is a sense of grievance, whether it's real or perceived grievances, and that can be applied to gangs, it can be applied to Islamist extremists, which is the area I deal primarily with. 2 is that grievance can lead to an identity crisis, which leads to wanting to belong to a bigger family. 3, then you have a charismatic figure that the person who's the young and vulnerable recruit can look up to and listen to. And then 4, there's a narrative or a propaganda that helps convince that young person that the way in which they've understood the grievances, they must be understood through this particular lens. When those 4 factors are combined together, you generally have somebody who's ripe and ready to join an extremist organization, regardless of whether it's religious, gang, or far-right fascist.
Once having been a member of an extremist or a more radical organization, how do you combat the roots, really? Given your personal experience, how do you want to combat the roots of radicalization?
So we're unique in the sense that we're doing something no one else has done before. When we first set up Quilliam, it was the first organization of its kind 3 years ago, and it's grown phenomenally since then because it's still one of the only organizations out there that does this work. But we've got this unique model where we address all 4 of the elements I've just identified. So when we talk about the grievances and the identity crisis, what we need to do there is we need to work with governments to devise policies that correct the grievances. Where they are legitimate grievances, they address them, and where they are perceived grievances, they communicate their strategies better to the aggrieved person. And when it comes to identity, we work with governments to devise a new sense of identity in this modern globalized world. Just to give you one example, currently in continental Europe, we don't have this catch-all label that the Americans have called American. Currently in Germany, in Denmark, in Holland, Dutch, Danish and German is an ethnicity, and so somebody who's born and raised in those countries but happens to be from a different ethnic origin isn't culturally considered Dutch, German or Danish. Now that's a huge problem. In the UK we've got the label British, which sort of follows the American label, because within that you can be British English, British Welsh, British Pakistani, British... Should we carry on?
Nothing happened.
Yeah, and you can be British Scot. So I think what we need to do with identity is, again, work with governments to help develop a more modern, globalized European sense of identity, regardless of one's faith or ethnicity. If they're born and raised in Europe, if they've got citizenship, then they're European. On the last 2, when it comes to the charismatic individuals and the narrative, again, our unique model is that we're working on the ground in countries like Pakistan. We've created the country's first counter-extremism social movement, that's working on the grassroots in Pakistan with the young and vulnerable students to inoculate them against the extremist narrative and to provide them with solid alternatives and to empower them with an awareness of what the democratic processes should be, and if they're missing, how they can create them.
Activists in Tunisia and the Arab Spring have often called their actions a revolution of dignity. Can you describe us what do they mean by that, and what conclusions can Western governments draw from this, dealing with governments who deal with Muslim countries currently?
Well, I think the interesting thing there is that if you look at Tunisia especially, people have differed on their analysis as to what caused it, but those who are calling it a revolution of dignity, their point was that it wasn't about jobs, it wasn't about employment levels and wealth. It was about political rights, because the people in Egypt and Tunisia felt they weren't being treated as human beings. And that regardless of whether they were employed or not, and if you notice, actually, the interesting thing is that the majority of young students that were out there were people that were educated. They were from the tech-savvy, young, globalized class, and yet they were out there on the streets protesting because they wanted their political rights. And so I think when they talk about dignity, that's what they're talking about. They want to be treated as citizens of their own countries and not constantly ignored by the dictator that claims he was a president. Now, when we talk about lessons, I think the lessons we can learn from that, something which is a theme which I think needs to come out much more than it has, but Ayan mentioned it in her talk yesterday, and that's that as Western policymakers, we've got to recognize that the age-old policy of supporting dictatorships in fear that somehow extremism will arise from that region is a flawed policy, and in the long run, as this uprising has shown us, it's going to come back to sting us. And we have to stop this policy and start supporting the legitimate democratic aspirations of those people.
Now, looking at the recent death of Osama bin Laden, the power of pictures in the media has proven to be decisive in creating the narrative of his death, and the public reaction to it in the Western but also in the Arab world. Now, how do you assess the role of media in containing radical movements in both the Western and the Muslim world?
Well, the media is crucial. You've hit the nail on the head. Now, we are locked in what I call a propaganda war currently. So we've got the legacy of the Arab Spring currently competing with the legacy of Islamism, Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Now, those two legacies present very different pictures of the world. And the Arab Spring, in fact, did so much more than any other effort so far in damaging and denting the credibility of the extremist legacy and the extremist propaganda. Now, when we talk about media and the media's role, what they should be doing is legitimately representing the legacy of the Arab Spring as the true aspirations of the young people in the MENA region. Sadly, sometimes what they do is they give disproportionate coverage to the extremists, as if the extremists are the ones who speak on behalf of the Arab street.
But why?
It makes good TV, sadly. It does make exciting and interesting television. It draws in viewers to watch somebody ranting. It's much more exciting to watch someone have an argument on television than it is to watch someone calm and sober and intellectual. And that's sadly the fact of life. And I think that if we have a media that's driven by commercial figures, as largely it is nowadays with the cable networks in America, then we're going to have to look at this problem and address it somehow. But it does definitely need to be addressed.
Mr. Nawaz, thank you very much for this conversation, and have a good time here at the Sangan Symposium.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.